We're going to be resuming with the lightning talk. So this is a great chance to get a little snippet into some of the exciting work that our students are doing around campus. For me, it's always cool to see, how many different areas around campus statistics touches. Everything from, econ to bio to Sloan to math. And we'll have a great representation across these different areas. So please join me in welcoming them. And let's try and keep it on time because we have a tight schedule.
Hello, everyone. Anyways, thanks for being here today. I want to talk about how we can privatize relational databases today, which is a problem that we were studying with my collaborators at IBM and my advisor Navid over the last few months. First, I'm going to explain the problem and different terms that you can see in the title. The first term is privacy. We learned it the hard way that we should pay attention to privacy when it comes to working with the data. There are so many data breaches, and it costs us a lot of money. Also, there are some regulations that we should obey. Because of that, it's been more than 2 decades of research of how we can formalize privacy and how we can design algorithms that preserve privacy. And when I talk about data sets, you can think of a table which each row represents an entity and each column represents a feature. So at the intersection of a column and a row, you can think of a value of that feature for that entity. And now we want to answer some questions about that data set. Let's call them query. There are 2 ways to do that. The first way is to ask the server to serve as an oracle and answer the queries one by one privately. The other way is to ask the server to create a synthetic data set privately and release that publicly so that everyone can use that. We call that synthetic data generation. There's a comparison between these 2 line of research, but roughly speaking, you can think of synthetic data generation as a more scalable method. And then there is one particular type of databases that haven't gained enough attention in the literature called relational databases, which is the case that we have multiple tables and they have some relations to each other. One example of that is household information and individuals' information in the US Census data. A more toy example is a student's data at MIT and professor's information, and we connect 2 entities together if they work with each other. And these specific type of databases are kind of tricky to privatize because, thank you. They are tricky to privatize because data leakage in one of the tables may lead to data leakage in the second. And the naive approach is just to merge these 2 tables together and create a master table, but this approach fails because of many reasons. The first thing that comes to mind is that the master table is going to be huge. So we were trying to figure out a way to solve this problem by adopting the research that people already have done on single table databases. And how we do that in an iterative way. First, we create the individual tables independently, and then we try to learn the best relationship for the synthetic tables that explains the original instance. How we do that, we privately identify the important cuts. As you can see, it's a bipartite graph there. We identify important cuts and privately observe the value of those cuts. Then having these observations and 2 synthetic tables, we try to project these observations into a bipartite graph so that these 2 tables and that bipartite graph explains the original instance. I don't have time to tell you about the exact results that we have, but basically what we have done is to characterize the error that we are going to get based on the privacy parameters that we choose for the problem. And yep, that's it. We go to the next system.
Hi, I'm David, and I'm going to briefly talk about a check on approaches for performing validation when we have a predictive method and data distributed in space. So the setup we'll imagine is we have some method for making predictions. It could be a physics-based method, it could be some data-driven method, but the important thing for us is that if we give it a point in space, it will predict some quantity, so we can think about something like predicting air pollution in the continental US. And we'll also have some points where we care about how well we're doing at making predictions. For example, some major cities like Boston and Detroit. And when we do validation, there's a couple questions we might want to answer. First, are the predictions being made by our method any good? And if we have a couple method for making predictions, which method should we prefer to use? So as well as having a method for making predictions, we'll have some data available to us that wasn't used in building the predictive method. So in this case, this might come from air quality monitors. So we've actually observed the air pollution at these yellow sites. And kind of given the sites currently on the map, it might not be totally clear if we can assess how we're doing it predicting in Boston and Detroit. So for example, the monitors probably have some noise on them, and we don't have any monitors precisely in either of these cities. What's hopefully at least intuitively clear is that we would hope if our monitoring network was dense enough in space, we would be able to estimate the error of our predictive method well. And so we formalize this as a consistency idea that if our validation data becomes increasingly dense in the spatial domain, we want to be able to consistently estimate the error of our predictive method. Surprisingly, we showed that some existing methods that are used and in the literature, including some approaches from the covariate shift literature, aren't consistent in this setting. And we showed that by making them more adaptive in adapting to both the locations where we have monitors available and the points we want to predict at, we can come up with an approach that is consistent in this setting. And if you want to hear more about this, please come talk to me later or send an email. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'll use the 2 minutes to talk about our work on nonlinear Bayesian optimal experimental design using logarithmic solve of inequalities. It's a joint work with Ayub and also my advisor, Yusuf. So we're basically considering the question, where should one observe to maximize the information gathered? So here is a plot. It's plotting the number of infected individuals versus time. So each line, for example, is an observation. And here, maybe we're more interested in underlying parameters. Say x would be like the transmission rate that we could not observe. And y here would just be the number of infected individuals. And the problem we're trying to solve here is trying to find the argmax, which is over the set A, of the mutual information between x and ya. So here y sub a is the subset of y, basically, such that the cardinality of the set A is k. Okay. So the standard approach is to just use the gradient method. So in each iteration, say the nth iteration, we're trying to find the item such that the difference after adding the item is maximized if we're already given the set A of L. So the challenge here is that mutual information estimation is usually expensive, especially when we're deviating from the linear Gaussian case. So here we propose to create a bound using log solve of inequalities. So here in nth iteration, we basically select the index corresponding to the largest diagonal entry of this matrix. So here on the first one here is expected value of the joint of the gradient of log of the posterior over the unselected one. On the right, here is just a covariance matrix of the conditional covariance matrix. So once you obtain those two matrices, you just delete rows and columns, and this one you just obtain using short complement. So this is a way of giving us to do Bayesian optimal experimental design without mutual information estimation. So if you want to read more, you can just scan this QR code or talk to me later.
Hi, my name's Devin. I'm going to present some work I did with my advisor, David Gomarnik. So for our problem, we were interested in studying deterministic high-dimensional integration, specifically trying to integrate functions defined with respect to a high-dimensional graphical model. So for the setup, basically, we take some graph, or actually we can extend it to hypergraphs, and some set of potentials defined on each edge. And we're interested in computing the integral of this function defined as the product of these potentials over the edges. And so our basic approach to solving this problem is to approximate the Riemann sum, since it's a discrete object and we have more discrete computation for it, to approximate the value of the integral. So the first step is we define this sort of induced probability distribution, where we we basically discretize the set and look at all the points in the Riemann sum over the set, and define a probability distribution that is at each point in the discrete set, basically the relative value of the function at that point divided by the total value. And we observe that basically if we can estimate these probabilities, we can estimate the value of the partition function, or the Riemann sum, as the case may be. So our strategy is basically we use what's called correlation decay, if you're familiar with it. It's basically the abstract idea that vertices that are far apart in the graph have nearly independent probability distributions. So that way we can only analyze a local part of the graph, get an approximation of the probability distribution, and then extract that out to compute the Riemann sum or partition function. So we managed to prove this theorem that basically says a bounded degree graph exhibiting correlation decay implies that we can have a deterministic quasi-polynomial time algorithm to approximate the integral. This is a pretty standard result, but unique to our specific problem setup with hypergraphs. And yeah, so then we studied a L1 contraction, which is somewhat standard in the literature, but with that we were able to, using this rather ugly condition that isn't super important, we were able to show that we actually do have a correlation decay, and therefore are actually able to come up with a deterministic algorithm to compute this integral. Specifically, basically, we get, as long as the value of the potential functions varies roughly as the potential functions vary in a range proportional to 1 over the degree of the graph squared, basically, is what we're getting in this, what we're capturing in this formula, sorry. As long as the potential functions vary proportionally within a range of 1 over delta squared, we're able to compute directly the value of this integral in a deterministic manner. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Vishwak, and today I'll be briefly talking about our work on fast sampling from constraint spaces using the Metropolis-adjusted mirror-Langevin algorithm. This is joint work with Ante Bibisono at Yale and my advisor, Asia Wilson and Eeks. So sampling from constraint spaces is a problem of practical value. A simple and popular example of a constraint distribution is a Dirichlet distribution, which is supported in a simplex. These mainly occur in Bayesian document modeling, and more generally, constraint domains occur in Bayesian modeling where you want to encode the parameter that we are interested in inferring, taking values only within a certain set. Outside of machine learning more broadly, in biological sciences, for instance, constraint sampling is also used to investigate metabolic networks in a cell. So formally, the goal is to sample from a distribution with density pi that's proportional to e to the minus f, where you also have this kind of support constraint, which indicates that my samples only come from within a set, which is convex and compact. Several approaches have been proposed to tackle this problem, and recently a new method was proposed called the mirror-Langevin algorithm, which combines the idea of the unadjusted Langevin algorithm for sampling from unconstrained spaces with the idea of mirror descent and optimization with a geometric flavor. So our work proposes a metropolis adjustment to the mirror-Langevin algorithm. The proposal Markov chain, or the distribution, is given by a single step of the mirror-Langevin algorithm, which is not reversible with respect to the target. Due to the availability of these proposal densities in closed form, you're able to compute an acceptance probability for a proposal that's generated by MLA and accept or reject based on that probability. This adjustment specifically results in a reversible Markov chain with respect to my target distribution pi. And under some nice conditions like self-concordance and relative strong convexity, smoothness, and relative Lipschitz continuity, we can also obtain non-asymptotic upper bounds on the mixing time of our algorithm. If you're interested in knowing more about this or any of the color-coded topics, I'm happy to chat, and thank you for your attention.
All right. Hi everyone. I'm Enzo. So yeah, I'm going to present my ongoing work with my advisor Yuri Poliansky about feature alignment using energy distance. So let me first talk about a problem setup. So basically, you want to like map one population to the other, and then you know that there's like an underlying map under it. So formally speaking, there's this we have defined this this map F that takes that takes some samples from population P, and then you want to map it to population Q, and then you want to, the objective function is this thing called energy distance, which is defined by this formula over here. So now the question is that why do we use energy distance, right? So usually for people for problems like this, people have already done that. You're using optimal transport. So I'll talk about like what is the advantage of this energy distance. So first of all, like it is a lot faster to compute compared to computing Wasserstein distance using optimal transport. Like for example, Wasserstein distance like W1. So as you can see over here, energy distance takes like the product of samples from P times number of samples in Q. Whereas if you use Wasserstein distance, then you need to find the optimal coupling. And even if you use synchron distance, which might be a bit faster, it is still it is still slower than using energy distance. And the other thing being the convergence. So let's say we have like high dimensional data, say like the dimension is D. Then this energy distance, if you have like n samples, then the convergence can be like something like 1 over square root n. Whereas for optimal transport, right, then it will take like n to the power of negative 1 over d, which is a lot slower. So now the question is that like is it possible to do gradient descent, i.e. like how likely are we going to be stuck in a local bed optimum? So what we have shown is some very theoretically it's like a very simple setting where you have like both P and Q are Gaussian, and in addition this underlying map F is also going to be linear. So now the task in this simplified setting, the task now reduced to like estimating just the matrix A and matrix B that brings from P to Q. So we showed that like in this setting, the energy distance of like Q hat and Q star, which is the ground truth versus what we predict, does not have a spurious local minimum with respect to A hat and B hat. So meaning that if this thing is if A hat and B hat is indeed the local minimum, it is also a global minimum, which also means that this hat Q and Q star is going to be the same. And finally, to show like as a point on like why would it work? So we did simulation on like Gaussian generated data, and then just to try to like standardize everything to 1,000 epochs. And then we do see that like for energy distance, not only it is like a lot faster, but it is also like it also performs well if you compute evaluate it using other metrics like Caal and also Hellinger distance. So yeah, thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about causal inference with panel data. So consider a matrix where each row corresponds to a unit, each column corresponds to a time, and each entry corresponds to a certain outcome. So suppose that each unit may begin an irreversible treatment at possibly different time, which is known as the staggered adoption design. So after the treatment, we cannot observe the counterfactual outcome, which are the entries labeled as T in this matrix. And to estimate the treatment effect, we may need to estimate these missing entries. And towards that, a usual scheme is to assume that the underlying outcome matrix is a low-rank matrix plus some noise. And then under this setting, it is possible to estimate these missing entries accurately. And this setting is quite useful in various applications. Let's just think about like various patients taking the pill at different time and the different states in US implementing a policy at different time. Okay, so existing methods for this problem are actually either statistically suboptimal or computationally expensive. So our proposed method first partition the observed outcome matrix into blocks. And to estimate each of the missing blocks, we will first reduce the problem to a simple 4-block structure by discarding some unimportant data in the gray blocks, like this. And then we will compute an orthonormal basis by computing the top R left singular subspace of this left submatrix M left. Next, we will denoise the upper submatrix by computing its best rank R approximation. And we will also extract the right block of it, which is in color blue. Finally, equipped with all these estimates, we can use linear regression to learn the coefficient of each column of this blue matrix in that orthonormal basis. And these coefficients, together with the orthonormal basis, will allow us to recover the missing block. And we may repeat this process to estimate each of the missing blocks. So we show that the entry-wise estimation error of our proposed method is approximately a zero mean Gaussian with tractable variance Vij star up to some negligible error. And this actually holds with minimal noise condition. And we also show that the variance term Vij star matches the local minimax risk, including pre-constants, for estimating Mij star, demonstrating the strong instance-dependent optimality of our estimator. In addition, we can also estimate the variance term Vij star accurately in a data-driven manner, which allows the construction of the shortest entry-wise confidence interval for the outcome matrix. That's all. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jachi. I'm a PhD in EECS working with Professor Caroline Wooler. This is joint work with Hiran and Caroline on membership testing Markov equivalence classes using conditional independence oracles. So to give a little bit of context, learning and testing are well-studied problems in various different fields, including information theory and learning theory. For example, we would be, if we're interested in the relationship between a k-element distribution and the uniform distribution, a very groundbreaking result by Terministic basically says that if you just want to test whether those two distributions are the same or not, you can use sublinear number of samples to do that. But if you really want to learn the k-element distribution, you actually need a linear number of samples. So testing will become particularly relevant in scenarios with limited data. For example, the particular scenario we're looking at here is causal discovery, which is the problem illustrated on the left box. You're given a data matrix of sample by dimension, and you're trying to extract the underlying causal graph between the dimensions. So you can usually do this by doing conditional independence tests. And then usually the existing constraint-based method use the number of conditional independence tests that is exponential in the number in the maximum degree of the graph. So another thing to note is that with observational data, which means you cannot do experimentation on the dimensions, the underlying causal graph is generally only identifiable up to its Markov equivalence class. So we asked the complement testing question here, which is, given a hypothesized Markov equivalence class, can we determine if the underlying causal graph belongs to it with observational data? So this is actually a new problem that has never been studied in the field. So for this problem, we show a matching lower and upper bound, which basically says to resolve this problem, you actually need a number of independence tests that's exponential in the maximum undirected click size of the graph. So there's always hold that the maximum undirected click size is smaller than the maximum in degree of the graph. So although this still says testing can require an exponential number of tests, this is slightly easier than learning. And we also provided a geometric interpretation of our result using the DAG associated hedron, which is basically a polytope with Markov equivalence class. And then on this, where we can show is learning actually corresponds to finding the sparsest vertices, whereas testing corresponds to verifying if a vertex is the sparsest. So this is a nice way to interpret why testing is a bit easier than learning. So if you're interested, I'm happy to talk about this, and thank you for your attention.
Hi everyone, I'm Xun Yi. I'd like to present a joint work with G.V. Shivashankar and Caroline Wooler. So in our work, we provide a general framework to utilize multiple data modalities for biological discoveries. To understand how cells in our body change in response to diseases, we can make different kinds of measurement. For example, on the left, we can measure the chromatin images of cells to understand cell regulation. We can measure protein images of different proteins to understand cell functions. However, existing methods were only able to analyze a single modality at a time. So new computational tools are needed to fully capture cell state by simultaneously taking into account multiple data modalities. And this is what we do in our methods. So we provide an autoencoder-based framework where we have one autoencoder for each modality and with a novel latent space structure. So in the latent space, we learn what information is shared between two modalities through this shared latent space component. And then we have one modality-specific latent space for each modality to capture the information unique to a particular modality, but is not shared with any other data modality that's also measured on the same cells. With this framework, we can then perform cross-modality prediction in the context of missing data. For example, if we want to measure protein images of cells, there are 20,000 proteins to choose from in a single human cell. Whereas in the same experiment, we can only measure up to tens of proteins. So how can we predict proteins that are not measured in an experiment using chromatin images, which is a more generic stain that contains a generic information of the state of cells? We do this in our model by looking at the shared information between chromatin and the target protein. We can infer the shared latent space component by using the chromatin encoder, and then decode the target protein image using the protein decoder. And then we have an experiment where we have chromatin images and a couple proteins as the ground truths. So you can see on the bottom right here that the prediction of our model compared to the ground truths is quite accurate. Whereas if you look at an existing model on the bottom left over there, the existing model based on a supervised model of imaging painting that takes in chromatin images and directly outputs protein images, the existing model completely failed this task. So beyond cross-modality prediction, our model is also able to let us interpret what information of the cell is captured in the shared space and what information of the cell is captured only by a particular modality. And this helps with its experimental design. For example, if we want to understand a feature of cancer cells, namely the number of DNA double-stranded breaks, and we want to see if we need to measure a particular protein marker of this feature, or if we can predict the protein marker of this feature directly from chromatin, we can look at the shared latent space between the chromatin and protein. So when we looked at the chromatin and protein, we found that the number of DNA double-strand breaks, which is a marker of cancer cells, is not in a shared space. This tells us in terms of experiment that we have to measure this protein marker in order to measure whether the cell is a cancer. So that's all I have. Thanks.